Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Foreign Correspondent Club of Thailand, and warm welcome to everyone following the FCCT's live stream as well. Excellencies, colleagues, and friends, thank you very much for taking the time for attending the Asia and the Pacific launch of International Ideas report on Global State of Democracy report. So my name is Liina Rikkilä-Tamang. I'm a director for Asia and the Pacific region at International IDEA, frequent visitor to this city, but otherwise based in Canberra in Australia. First, I wish to thank the FCCT for co-hosting yet another event with us here in Bangkok. And it is indeed more than suitable to have this launch in Thailand, in a country where so many, for so long, have been engaged in efforts to bring a full-fledged democracy. And also wish to thank Surin Pitsuwan Foundation and its president, Fuadi Pitsuwan, for co-hosting this event with us and for being here today. And I presume, Fuadi, you will, in your remarks, share the connection between International IDEA and the Surin Pitsuwan Foundation. International IDEA is an intergovernmental organization with 34 member states and counting, dedicated to supporting democracy worldwide. And we are indeed very proud of our very global, diverse membership, representing democracies from all continents, including several from Asia and the Pacific region. Let me say just a few words about the main headline findings and then about how this report is different from the previous ones, what makes this year's report so special, and then briefly introduce our speakers and panelists today. We are indeed launching this report at very troubling times, democracy is being challenged externally and internally. And 2022 was the sixth consecutive year in which countries with net declines outnumbered those with net advances. So this is the longest consecutive fall since our records began in 1975. Interestingly, the overall trend of democratic decline in Asia and the Pacific has largely stabilized, though Myanmar and Afghanistan remain significant exceptions. And yet, this stabilization has not led to a turnaround of democratic revival either. So challenges persist, particularly in the areas of free speech and media censorship. And across the region, ineffective legislative bodies and suppression of organized civil society have left the judiciary, anti-corruption agencies, or mass public demonstrations as the primary forces countering this trend. For example, a couple of weeks ago, we welcomed the news of Senator Leila de Lima's release, even if provisional, after more than 6 years of pre-trial detention in the Philippines, positive step toward the rule of law in the Philippines. The Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission has solved several high-profile corruption cases over the years and secured indictment of 2 former prime ministers. In Sri Lanka, the People's Movement, Aragalaya, forced the President Rajapaksa to step down when other means were exhausted in keeping the government accountable. And there are, of course, at least an equal number of negative examples that one could cite here. But it is the performance and functioning of these countervailing institutions, or new checks and balances, as we call them, that this year's report is focusing on. What are those preconditions and circumstances that allow these checks and balances to work and fulfill their mandate? So from the very beginning, International IDEA's GSOD, or Global State of Democracy Initiative, was designed with an emphasis on analytical detail and nuance. And this year, we have continued to refine this approach with 2 important changes. First, we now rank countries in 4 major categories of democratic performance, rather than 1 overall classification. And these 4 categories are representation, rights, rule of law, and participation. And second, this year's GSOD report draws both on this long-standing GSOD indices, which is a data set, as well as to our new democracy tracker, which monitors democratic developments in 173 countries on a continuous basis. So it is this unique combination of quantitative and qualitative information that further fine-tunes our assessment. So with this report, we intend to pay more attention to democratic change rather than to democratic level, and to nuances of democratic practice rather than to general normative labels. So in our view, trends and nuances are the stuff that good policy making to enhance democracy is really made of. So you, the readers, obviously, of this report will be the judges of if we have succeeded in this effort. Obviously, it seems that the new approach presented in this report seeks to make the findings more policy relevant, even if it tells a more complex story. So to discuss these findings, we have a truly excellent panel bringing in the regional perspectives and telling us whether and how this year's findings actually resonate with their first-hand observations and experiences. These findings will be first presented by my colleague, Dr. Shima Shah, who is the head of our democracy analysis unit at our headquarters in Sweden, Stockholm. And it is Sima and her team who has really aggregated and analyzed the data and written this report. And our moderator today is Salsabida Abdul Manan, or Sally, who is the senior executive and researcher at the Democracy and Governance Unit of IDEAS, Malaysia. And I should mention that amongst her many achievements, she is also the leading force behind the all-party parliamentary group trying to regulate political financing through the Political Financing Act, PFA. Such an important work. So thank you so much for agreeing to moderate this session today. So let me also introduce our other panelists. We have Kunda Dixit, a journalist from Nepal, publisher of Himal Media, and until very recently, editor of the Nepali Times. And also he is also a chair of the Center for Investigative Journalism in Nepal. And someone who has really documented and wrote about Nepal's conflict and subsequent peace process through photography and his writings. And I was lucky to see one of his photo exhibitions, A People's War in Kathmandu, some years back. We have Tan Hui Yi, who is the Bangkok-based bureau chief of Straits Times, well known to this audience here. She's also a board member of the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand and co-founder of the Gender Beat, a collective of journalists working to support and grow gender-conscious journalism around the world. And we have Dr. Paikya Soti Saravanamuttu, or Sara, with friends, who is the founder executive director of the Center for Policy Alternatives, CPA, in Sri Lanka. And amongst his many positions and many titles, he is also currently a member of the board of the Amnesty International of South Asia. And Sarah is really one of the rare combination of a brilliant scholar and a fearless human rights activist. And last, but definitely not least, our Pandit Chan Rochanakit, who is the associate professor in the Faculty of Political Science at the Chulalongkorn University here in Bangkok. And apart from his own research and democracy analysis, he has translated the book, How Democracies Die, by Giblat and Lewitsky into Thai language. So thank you so much to you all. We look very much forward to hearing from you. Let me conclude my opening remarks by simply stating that this year's report is also our small tribute to the democracy activists and human rights defenders around the world. And I would like to refer to this book by Sean Turnell, An Unlikely Prisoner. Professor Sean Turnell is Australian economist who was detained by Myanmar's military junta soon after the coup in February 2021. He is now safe back at home, but in his book, he is really acknowledging the bravery and determination of his fellow Myanmari detainees, and one of them being U Win Tain, the senior NLD leader and member of parliament, and also father to someone who worked at International IDEA's Myanmar team. And when he was moved from the Mandalay prison to Naypyidaw prison, his parting words to Sean were, as documented here, 21 years and still counting, and it's all been worth it. So thank you all once again for being here today, and now I would like to hand it over to my colleague Sima. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to be here today and allowing us the chance to present the Global State of Democracy's latest findings. This new report, called The New Checks and Balances, provides an overview of global and regional trends and dives deep into the role of countervailing institutions and the ways that these institutions bolster and protect democracy. Before we begin, it's useful to understand the conceptual framework here up on the screen, upon which all of our analysis is based. This is our definition of democracy here. As you can see, we divide the concept into 4 broad categories. These are representation, rights, rule of law, and participation. Associated with each of these broad categories are several factors, and underneath those factors are hundreds of source indicators. Altogether, we measure 157 individual indicators of democracy and human rights across 173 countries around the world, starting in 1975 and going to the end of 2022. This quantitative data set is updated once a year. This year, the conceptual framework is slightly modified. It's new, including rule of law at the aggregate level for the first time. We believe that our focus on the performance at this level of category and factor, rather than on regime classification, helps us provide more nuance, helps us more strategically and specifically target areas of progress and decline, and helps us create actionable and specific policy recommendations. This year, our analysis is also based on our 1-year-old tool called the Democracy Tracker, which is a qualitative data set meant to complement our annually updated quantitative scores. The Democracy Tracker provides monthly updates and event reports, also in those 173 countries, so that you can see what specific events are impacting the status quo in terms of democracy and human rights at the country level. The rest of the presentation will proceed as follows. I will start with a broad overview of what the global trends show, followed by a brief explanation of what we mean by countervailing institutions and why we chose to focus on them. And then I will look closely at the Asia and Pacific findings, closing with a broad overview of our policy recommendations. Our report comes out at a time of multiple crises. In addition to the continuing and devastating violence and repression by regimes in Myanmar and Afghanistan, and ongoing wars in Europe and the Middle East, we are in the midst of a global cost of living crisis, a climate disaster, a wave of coups, a surge in migration, and the reversal of key democratic gains in countries that had only recently reopened. But all is not lost, and to illustrate why, I will begin with a short story. Most of you in this room will probably have heard of Leila de Lima, the Philippine politician who has been in the spotlight because despite never having been convicted, she was in prison for 6 years. Her most recent troubles began soon after she launched a Senate investigation into the former president's brutal anti-drug crackdown, marked by what the International Criminal Court calls the unlawful killing by the Philippine National Police and others acting in concert with them of between several thousand and tens of thousands of civilians. Last week, de Lima was released on bail, and almost immediately, amid serious personal security risks and threats, she is having to deal with the remaining charge against her, that of conspiracy to commit illegal drug trafficking. But de Lima's mark on the political and social landscape in the Philippines goes much deeper than what is currently in the news. In fact, some of her most notable successes include the passage of milestone anti-poverty legislation, and it was under her watch, as the head of the Interagency Council Against Trafficking, that the Philippines was finally removed from the US human trafficking watch list. Thus far, her career and her victories have been the result of her nimble use of the very countervailing institutions we focus on in our report. The legislature, she is a senator. The judiciary, she is a lawyer and a defendant. Fourth branch institutions, she was the head of the National Human Rights Commission in the Philippines. Regional bodies and civil society, the UN, the European Parliament, and Amnesty International have all called for her release. After everything she has been through and continues to go through, upon her release, she said this of the countervailing institution of the judiciary. The justice system, no matter how defective, still works, with a lot of patience and with a lot of hope. Democracy in the Philippines is richer because of her efforts, and the ways in which she called on the relative expertise of all of these countervailing institutions is a testament to exactly how democratic change happens. And now for the findings. First, net declines at the country level outnumber net advances for the 6th consecutive year. This is the longest period in which we have seen this particular pattern since we began collecting data in 1975. In some extreme cases, like that of Myanmar and Afghanistan, the number of declines was as high as 11 out of 17 metrics. Second, 3 areas where we see some of the most widespread declines include the bedrock institutions of democracy. In the area of representation, these are credible elections and effective parliament. These were 2 of the most widely affected aspects of democratic performance. Some of the declines are due to extreme events, like the wave of coups in West Africa. But even in contexts that are not as dire as that, we have seen drops that are due to unequal playing fields and weakened electoral management bodies. These problems are compounded by weak parliaments that struggle to contain executive overreach and are therefore unable to halt the dismantling of democratic institutions. But at the same time, there have been some inspiring elections around the world, including in Malaysia, where results demonstrated the electorate's frustration with years of corruption and the status quo, and in Latvia, where the 2022 parliamentary elections followed improvements to the electoral law, including the introduction of online voter registration. Third, the overall pattern of decline in our metrics of respect for human rights is a stark reminder of how vulnerable democracies can be. In 2022, no country experienced a significant improvement in the protection and exercise of rights when compared with its performance 5 years prior. You can see this here, where this red line indicates no advances in 2022. Performance regarding respect for civil liberties is particularly worrying, with notable drops in the core democratic rights of freedom of expression, freedom of association, and freedom of the press, impacting every region of the world. Examples include the targeting of critical expat journalists in Bangladesh and the restrictions of access for media who are critical of the president in South Korea. There have also been broader continuing problems around the world with internet restrictions, violence against, harassment of, and even the murder of journalists, and surveillance scandals. There were several instances, however, in which multiple countervailing institutions came together to successfully advance rights related to gender and sexuality. This occurred in places as diverse as Mexico, Finland, India, and Spain. In 2022, the rule of law at the global level remained in the mid-range band of performance, but all regions again experienced notable 5-year declines. Our data show drops in the independence of judiciaries in particular in every region of the world. But people's experiences of democracy are also impacted by their personal safety and their ability to go about their daily lives with a sense of security. This is also a concern in every region in the world, with the most notable drops in the past 5 years observed in the Americas. The hope for the future of democracy remains firmly in the realm of public participation, where we have seen striking dynamism and diversity. While global trends do not yet show large aggregate shifts, some of the country-level developments could indicate more long-term future progress. The data even show that it's not uncommon for participation to persist and even thrive in places that are challenged in serious ways. This can be seen clearly on the map, where lighter colors are higher performing countries with regard to participation. One example is in Zambia, where civil society helped establish a public register of mining interests, strengthening accountability by disclosing who stands to benefit from owning those corporate assets. Countries like the Dominican Republic, the Maldives, Fiji, and Ethiopia have also shown improvements in metrics of the space for civil society. In order to understand what is happening in a more in-depth way, we devoted this year's analysis to countervailing institutions, the set of governmental and non-governmental bodies that balance the distribution of power between the branches of government, but also ensure that popular priorities are consistently featured in decision-making. They encompass what we traditionally understand as checks and balances within the formal structures of government, but they also include the multiple popular movements, institutions, organizations, and bodies that act to protect the equal access to and public control of decision-making. These include civil society, ethics bodies, ombuds offices, anti-corruption commissions, election management bodies, and more. This graph illustrates the roles and relative strengths of these institutions, emphasizing the importance that they be independent and also of cross-institutional collaboration as a key point for success. So to recap, democracy continues to be in decline. These declines have been most broadly seen in representation and rights. Deteriorating respect for people's civil liberties continues, but countervailing institutions have been found to act as critical checks on executive overreach. People's continued willingness and enthusiasm for participation continues to light the way ahead, even in very challenged contexts. And now to turn to Asia and the Pacific. The data in the region show that after several years of across-the-board declines, 5-year and 1-year trends now paint a picture of institutional stability across the region, with the notable exceptions of Myanmar and Afghanistan. Here you can see where there have been net advances and declines over the past 5 years, with red showing more decline and blue showing more advance. Given the very few countries that have experienced deep change, it's tempting to be able to see this as stability, but most countries in the regions continue to perform below the global average in rule of law, rights, and representation, so 3 out of the 4 categories. Still, it is important to note and learn from bright spots. 2 prominent examples in the data set are Malaysia and the Maldives, where notable improvements in credible elections, free political parties, the absence of corruption were all noted. Thailand is also a bright spot this year. The graph on the screen shows you the scores at the category level over the past several years. While the jump in representation in particular is encouraging, it is important to note that many of the indicators that led to these jumps started from a very low point, and even now perform only in the low-level band of performance. This applies to credible elections, free political parties, and effective parliament. A continuing area of worry for the region is civil liberties, where India, the Philippines, and Sri Lanka saw significant drops over the past 5 years, as did already low-performing China and Afghanistan. Asia and the Pacific's regional average for civil liberties is well below the global average, and most people in the region live in a country which has seen a significant 5-year decline. Freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and freedom of association are especially concerning, as they largely continued the downward trend they have been experiencing for many years. The graph here shows you some of the country patterns since 2018 in freedom of expression and freedom of the press. some of the changes that have made international headlines and which explain these trends are already well known. Think of the former Philippine government's refusal to renew the franchise of the country's biggest radio and TV network, or a 2021 report that showed that more than 150 local newspapers in Australia were forced to shut down, a result of a context that Reporters Without Borders calls an oligarchic model of media ownership concentration. On the bright side, however, in the Maldives, the government repealed a defamation law that had been used to pressure independent media, and an amendment that required permission from police before protesting was abolished. When we look at the rule of law, we continue to note the importance of the courts, which in many cases have stepped in to protect democracy. What you see here is a picture of how the sub-regions across the Asia and Pacific perform with regard to the rule of law, which in our data set includes measures of judicial independence, the absence of corruption, personal safety, and the degree to which public sector officials are held accountable equally before the law. Even where countries where these measures are not strong, judiciaries have been core defenders of the rule of law and the expansion of civil rights. Key examples include Sri Lanka and Pakistan, where the Supreme Courts have been called on to uphold the right to vote in response to executive decisions seeking to postpone local elections in 2023. In defiance of court orders, elections in both cases remain delayed, signaling growing points of contention between the judiciary and the executive. Also critical in the region and across the world have been national anti-corruption commissions, which have proven to be a vital check on executive power. Australia, whose absence of corruption score has not yet recovered from a decline in 2013, took the positive step in 2022 of establishing a federal anti-corruption commission to boost whistleblower protections. The work of the Indonesian Corruption Eradication Commission led to the conviction of hundreds of individuals, including high-ranking officials, between 2005 and 2019. The KPK's key successes were made possible due to the support it received from other countervailing institutions like civil society and the media. And again, mirroring global patterns, people across the region still seem enthusiastic about engaging. What you see here is a picture of participation scores between 2017 and 2022. The head of the arrow indicates the score in 2022, while the circle indicates 2017. The yellow indicates that most countries continue to be in the mid-performing band. Major changes have occurred in Fiji and the Maldives, which have seen significant advances in the space for civil society, while Taiwan remains the highest-ranked country in the region. Mass public participation in electoral cycles remains the most powerful countervailing force, as underlined by the 2022 Malaysian and 2023 Thai elections. But protest is not all, nor is electoral participation. In Fiji, civil society has benefited from the opening of space and has successfully pushed back against things like attempts to reform rather than repeal the repressive Media Industry Development Act. In addition to what may be a lack of domestic political will, some of the region's countries have been subject to external pressure. The lingering economic cost of the pandemic continues to put pressure on low and middle income countries in the region, and some analysts say that Asia and Pacific will be the region that has the most significant long-term economic shock as a result of the pandemic. According to an April 2023 Asian Development Bank report, 23 countries in our data set in this region are at high or moderate risk of being unable to manage their external debt in the near future, which has serious implications for institutions' ability to progress in democratic rights. So now, what should we do? First, we must prioritize better and stronger regional cooperation. In the face of enhanced competition between great powers, states across the region should strengthen multilateral cooperation to protect and grow regional democracy, protect their domestic policy autonomy, and their ability to provide for the well-being of their citizens as they see fit. While forums like ASEAN and the Pacific Island Forum do exist, stronger international cooperation is needed to deal with an array of challenges. These range from security and rights concerns, like the junta in Myanmar, to global collective action issues, like the need to push global creditors to constructively participate in sovereign debt management. One example here is what is known as debt swaps, where creditors provide debt relief in exchange for government commitment to things like climate action, although climate action is not the only example. UNDP is working with Laos right now to consider such an option, but stronger regional cooperation and dialogue could help boost this option for other countries, as well as focus attention on whether this works and how it could have potential negative side effects for countries in the region. Second, it is important to maintain strong countervailing institutions, especially the emergent independent bodies that have proven effective. Institutional protection against authoritarian overreach should not be so strong that it undermines democratic institutions from an unexpected direction, like what are known as paper tiger anti-corruption commissions. The Westminster Foundation for Democracy has an assessment framework for independent oversight institutions, which is a strong way to start in terms of evaluating how these bodies are doing. Donor governments can provide support to the co-development of mutually supporting electoral management bodies, anti-corruption bodies, and judiciaries in terms of promoting cross-institutional collaboration, which we know has worked. Third, there's the issue of strengthening parliamentary oversight. Parliaments should improve oversight mechanisms to enhance public confidence. Parliamentarians should leverage the expertise and the scrutinizing power of civil society and the media to harmonize competing interests when holding the government to account, while also providing the opposition and minority parties with opportunities to engage in oversight activities. Transparency International's parliamentary oversight tool provides one way for stakeholders to evaluate the strength of a particular legislature's oversight mandate. The public consultations on electoral bills conducted by the Fijian Parliament, as well as engagement between Parliament and civil society in Malaysia with regard to introducing gender impact assessments, are both very useful examples. And finally, we need continuing support to the media, who are core actors in thriving democracies. Donors and democracy assistance providers should scale up efforts in providing technical and financial assistance to independent media initiatives, while at the same time advocating for robust legal protections for journalists, including mechanisms offering rapid response to threats and violence. There's one story which I'd like to leave you with, and that is in Australia. In some ways, the country's democratic outlook has taken a beating. Last month, voters rejected a proposal to officially recognize Indigenous peoples in their constitution and establish an Indigenous advisory body to the National Parliament. It was a blow, seen by supporters as a refusal by the majority to acknowledge how the brutal dispossession of Indigenous groups underwrites the very advantages that majority communities now enjoy. And it was seen as a disregard for the systematic ways in which these groups have been and continue to be marginalized. But this isn't nearly the end of the story. At the subnational level, there have been signs of progress. In Victoria, Aboriginal Victorians have worked with the government to create the country's first Truth Commission, an independent authority to oversee negotiations between Indigenous groups and the government, a self-determination fund to support Aboriginal Victorians, and a framework to negotiate a treaty between Indigenous groups and the government. In South Australia, the government passed a law to create a voice body to the regional parliament there, and in Tasmania, an Aboriginal advisory group is consulting about pathways forward for truth-telling and treaty development there. These lesser-known but significant victories have been the result of cross-institutional collaboration, from the legislatures who have been involved in the dialogue, to the civil society groups who have represented community interests, to the media who have publicized the issue, and of course to the commissions who will craft recommendations out of things like truth-telling processes. This story is a perfect illustration of how complicated democratic processes can be. There can be bright spots, even as darkness falls, and there can be worrying developments, even as progress is apparent. And this is precisely why it is important for all of us who care about the future of democracy to pay attention to the nuance to the individual events that can signal change. Though it remains to be seen if and how the Australian efforts bear fruit and what path lies ahead for a national election, this story is a picture of the potential of countervailing institutions to take the first important steps in what will hopefully be an eventual triumph in the protection of the democratic will. I leave you here with the URL for the report, which I really hope you will read, as well as a mention of the new democracy tracker tool. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sima, for the excellent presentation. Good morning to all attendees and esteemed panelists. Now, we hope to address 4 to 5 questions so that we will have allocated time for the attendees to ask questions at the end of the event. And before we begin, I would like to remind all the panelists to try to answer the questions within 5 minutes so that we will be able to finish on time. And we can start with Dr. Pandit, and we'll just move to the right. Okay, now to open the discussion, allow me to ask the first questions to our esteemed panelists. The first question would be, how do the findings of the report resonate with the country or regional experiences you are most familiar with? Please go ahead, Dr. Pandit.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here with all present guests here. And I found the report, in short, it's very interesting to see all the 4 categories to measure what is the performance of one particular country. And of course, I'm glad to see the ranking of Thailand in terms of democracy gets higher. But in details, I found there are a lot of things that probably we need to have a closer look, because Thailand experienced a polarization in our society for many years, let's say more than 2 decades now. And even though the return of police colonial Thaksin Shinawatra still feel like people feel the end of our polarization will end, but it's not. So looking at this report, I think it's very important to understand the whole measurements and all the 4 categories in terms of representation. Of course, we are doing well. We get so much better in terms of rights. Of course, still we have to take a closer look on the case against the youth, the leaders of youth uprising between 2020 and 2021. They are still struggling with legal battle against the Thai state or Thai establishment. And of course, in terms of rule of law, I think this is very crucial to take a closer look as well, because the process of judicial review in Thailand is very special phenomenon, because we are ignited by, of course, the royal speed back in as early as 2006. So the independency of judicial branch in Thailand is still obscure in terms of the protection of human rights. And of course, we see the cases against, for example, Anon Nampa, the Gwangju Human Rights Prize laureate, and also any other youth leaders. So we are having the biggest problem, because many of them are still in school, they are in their universities. So this is really important to take a closer look in terms of the rule of law. And of course, the participation, I think, is very important as well to see. Of course, we had a this year we have a general election, and then probably brought us the most delightful moment for only 2 months. The grace period was too short. And then the new pact between the Pheu Thai party and the old establishment, including the former junta ruling parties, I think we have to take a closer look as well. So looking at the report and to address the case of Thailand, I think we might have to understand what is going on in the ground to to match with the report. And of course, so roughly, I found the report is really relevant because I like the measurement that you made, and it sounds very important as well to address the problem highlighted by Professor Michael Ignatieff, who gives a recommendation to incorporate the roles of university as a countervailing institution, or CI. I think this is very important because in Thailand we have CIs, for example, Thai Lawyer for Human Rights, which play a really crucial role during the polarization in Thai politics, and also my group, my friend, my colleagues in university, the Thai Academic Networks for Civil Rights. I think we still wait for this government to launch probably the amnesty law for all the youth leaders who became the prisoner of conscience, and also all the cases against the junta government during the last, let's say, at least 20 years. So we have to take a closer look. But overall, I think the report is really relevant, and I think it's very important for Thai audience to read the same thing that I just said, and probably take a closer look at all the measurements provided by the report. It's very interesting to see. This is the first response of mine.
Thank you, Dr. Pandit. Ms. Huyi?
Thank you. I broadly agree with the general trends highlighted in the report for the region that I cover. So a little bit of background here. I cover about half of Southeast Asia. That's Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam. Myanmar, of course, is the outlier in this case because of the coup in 2021 and the subsequent armed conflict and the severe deprivation taking place there. But in nearby countries, I think things are a bit more tentative, taking into account some of the major transitions that took place this year. In Thailand, like Pandit said, we had an election. There was one by this young progressive political party, but eventually led to the formation of a government by a party that was kicked out of power twice by military coups. Right? And then next door in Cambodia, we saw one of the longest serving prime ministers in the world make way for his son after a very tightly managed election. And in the lead up to that election, we saw the political space systematically tightened. So we had the main opposition party there that was disqualified. Many of the opposition activists exiled, and the media outlets that were critical of the government shuttered. So the directions that both countries will take after these transitions are not immediately apparent. While in Thailand, we can sort of assume that this Thai government will be more progressive, more pro-democracy maybe. We do not know what kind of compromises it will have to make with the conservative pro-military factions that it is currently in bed with. In Cambodia, while many government critics have been intimidated into silence, there is some hope that the new Prime Minister, Mr. Hun Manet, could reopen democratic spaces after he consolidates his position. So overall, I would say that conditions have bottomed out in the region, but there is tentative hope for progress, if of course Myanmar being the sole exception.
Thank you, Ms. Huyi. Dr. Sarah?
Yeah, I think there is this constant debate as to whether culture determines institutions or institutions determine culture. And there is this constant dialectic. So in that respect, I think, I would agree with the findings of the study that institutionally we have done a little better, but the question is, why is it that we are not going forward, and why is it that, in South Asia, from where I come from, Sri Lanka will face an election in in October of next year. Bangladesh faces an election next year. So does India. Pakistan, well, we don't know what will happen in Pakistan. Maldives has just had an election. And, Nepal, today I think there are major demonstrations in terms of monarchy, anti-monarchist sentiments. Is that reflected in the report? Are those things flagged? And so what I want to suggest is that, yes, with regard to institutions, fine, yes, there has been a certain amount of stabilization, but those institutions, again, are a consolidation of a particular bias. Is that bias being challenged and is it changing? Where are those changes coming from? Do you take into account that the world's largest democracy is probably ceasing to be the world's largest democracy because of the strength of the Hindutva popular culture as far as India is concerned? And that is very serious, because if the global balance of power is to shift towards Asia, we are talking about China on the one hand, India on the other, and the hope was always that India would be the bastion and the champion of liberal democracy. But unfortunately, and I don't think I'm caricaturing, India is perhaps becoming more like China than the other way around. And that's something to watch out for in terms of the future. Also, we have the whole question of social media. In my country, Sri Lanka, we had an unprecedented uprising of people, the Aragale. That would not have happened if not for social media. The galvanizing of people together. However, it was horizontal. There was no structure in terms of what was to be obtained, what the political goals, etc. were. So broadly speaking, they got the Rajapaksa dynasty out of government, but they didn't get them out of politics. The level of political literacy amongst those who were involved in that movement was unfortunately shockingly low. In July 1983, we had a horrendous pogrom against the Tamil community in Sri Lanka. Not that many people knew about it. Today, those people are looking for ways to get out of the country because the economy is affecting them so badly. So we are fast heading towards a remittance economy status as a consequence. Now, what does that do for a country, or indeed countries where, if democracy is to succeed, if it is to flourish, etc., it must answer to needs. If it doesn't provide those solutions or provide the framework within these solutions can be found, it's going to fail. And that is my biggest concern, that with the challenge of AI, with the challenge of climate change, what would citizens in South Asia be looking for in 10 to 15 years? Are we going to have to rely on a judiciary like we did in my country, that a judiciary turned around and said that the Rajapaksa brothers were responsible for bankrupting the country? There are those of us who, yes, we believe that that was the case. But is that the role of the judiciary? On what matter of law was it deciding on? So the institutions of democracy are also getting fudged in a way. There is that resistance that's coming from there, but that resistance is also coming at a price. Instead of being the last resort, the judiciary is now becoming the first resort.
Dr. Sarah, another 1 minute.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Dr. Sarah. Okay, Kunda?
Thank you. I really don't envy International IDEA for trying to put together a report on the global state of democracy, because how do you really quantify and measure this? And especially in a place like the Asia Pacific, which is, as we know, not one continent, but at least 3. And but I'm glad that it is named and shamed countries, and mostly shamed, because there are very few which have been named and famed. In fact, even the countries that have not moved downwards haven't really moved up on the scale. And the subtitle for the report is The New Checks and Balances. And unfortunately, the checks and balances actually in our countries now mean writing a check, which is usually from a politician to from a businessman to a politician, which then is about balances, which is a bank balance. So the checks go to bank balances. And that is probably where the kleptocracy is undermining democracy. It's a mixed bag. And as Sarah was just saying, the cultural aspect of this needs to come out a little more in quantifying it. We have, in general, South Asia is going downhill. What is happening in India is worrying for most of us. India is just such a giant planet that its gravitational pull is affecting all the smaller countries around it, the smaller neighbors. In fact, compared to India, Pakistan is actually looking good. And Bangladesh, the elections in January, the run-up to the elections, we have seen repression. The control of media is even tighter. And most of what's been happening to the Nobel Peace Prize winner Mohammed Yunus, and the court cases against him, the cases and defamation cases that have been filed against publishers and editors in Bangladesh, has completely dampened press freedom there. Sri Lanka, Sarah just spoke about, but my own country, Nepal, the wind is blowing from the south. And as Sarah said, we are squeezed between China and India. So it has always been India's democratic space and open society that we could lean back on whenever totalitarian China and the dragon was breathing down our necks. But no more. India is now resembling China more and more in terms of its controls, its persecution of minorities. And even as I speak just now, this very hour in Kathmandu, there are two rival rallies going on. One is a pro-monarchy, anti-secular rally, and a rival rally by the other side. We haven't had such big rallies in Nepal for a long time. So you could take this as a freedom of expression issue, but it could also mean that things are unraveling. And the reason they're unraveling is, of course, because the so-called democratic parties, the mainstream parties, have been so feckless in delivering over the last 2 or 3 decades. And the economic meltdown, further aggravated by COVID, as well as the rise in food and fuel prices, means that populism is undermining pluralism. I think I'll end there.
Thanks, Kunda. So glad to hear that all the panelists actually think that the report resonates for each country. And also I would like to highlight the India becoming more like China because of control and the prosecution of the minority. And second point, very good raised by Dr. Sarah, the importance of the social media, for structure of the social media. And of course, the importance to quantify the cultural need. Okay, so my next question would be, this year's report shows that broad democratic declines in Asia have ended, but we have yet to see that turnaround into positive improvements. Why do you think the decline has ended, but the improvements are stalled? Maybe we can start with Kunda.
Yeah, this is just to carry on and continue what I was saying, which is the epic struggle between pluralism and populism, and that the foundation of it is on economic frustration and also disillusionment with the mainstream parties being unable over a long period of time, after having been given many chances over many elections to undo the wrongs and to actually deliver the goods. So we tend to blame the populist leaders and the demagogues and the despots, but the real reason they are rising is because of the failures of the so-called democratic parties, who have actually hijacked the electoral process so that they can just shuffle the cards every 4 years, elect themselves to power, and keep on doing what they were doing. And I think there it is, it's not surprising that they are using the same tested model from the world's largest democracy and the oldest democracy to have this drift towards elected demagogues who use the electoral system to get themselves to power, and then once they're there, they undermine the very institutions that got them elected in the first place. And here I think the media, especially the role of social media, comes into play. The co-opting of mainstream press by using the publishers and the journalists, and then the social media, of course, by weaponizing it against any opposition, so that anyone who's critical of the government is self-censoring and is afraid to speak out. So this is a deadly combination at a time when we need a free and independent press more than ever before to tackle some of these crises. We find that the media is weaker than ever before, both financially because of the business model has collapsed, but also because of these corporate and political controls.
Okay, thanks, Kunda. Dr. Sarah?
Yeah, I endorse everything that Kunda just said. I want to suggest to you that a lot of what is happening in terms of the democracy backsliding is a response to globalization. It is a response to globalization in terms of people within national sovereignties feeling that they're being neglected because jobs are going elsewhere, from the Make America Great Again to various notions of that in our part of the world, where the idea is, look, in India it's about Hindutva. It's about Hinduism being the major cultural religion, and the cultural influence in the country long before the Muslims came. And therefore you identify them as the other. In Sri Lanka we had riots against the Tamils, we had riots against the Muslims, and both of them were in charge of the retail trade. You know. So what we need is greater political literacy, recognizing that in our parts of the world we have functioned for centuries on the basis of unity in diversity, and that there should be greater acknowledgement of the contributions of all the various communities in that country. So therefore the education system is tremendously important, where you don't, for example, teach one religion in schools, where you teach comparative religion if you have to teach religion at all, you know, and where you try to develop citizens of a functioning democracy rather than of one particular country, frogs in a well, who see the outside world as the other, if you like. Now, social media has a tremendous part to play in it. And of course, social media is not a force for the good or a force for the bad. It is an instrument. And I think the liberal democratic consensus, such as there has existed over the last 50 years in our parts of the world, needs to come up with ways of appealing to the masses in ways that they understand, in language that is understandable, in ways that are accessible. It is breaking the bounds of the echo chambers of social media and having an actual conversation. As I said to you earlier, in my country, during the Aragalaya, they did not know what happened in July 1983, probably the worst tragic, cataclysmic event in our country's history. So it has to be not the lengthy pieces of the Guardians, etc. It has to be shorter, it has to be punchier, it has to be more incisive, and it has to get through to the young people. A lot has been said about how we must involve the young people. But quite frankly, do the young people know where they're coming from? It's a question too, as to know where they're going to. What do they want? In 10 to 15 years' time, they are going to decide the political agenda. What place is democracy going to have on it?
Thanks, Dr. Sarah. Ms. Hui? You.
Earlier on, we talked a bit about the rule of law. I want to focus a bit more on the rule by law, which is quite distinct from what's taking place right now. I think we tend to assume that things move in a pendulum fashion, that countries that elect progressive leaders will eventually see an expansion of the democratic space. But I find that authoritarian institutions or the regimes have a lasting effect. To use the economic term, they tend to be a bit sticky. And the other thing I notice is that authoritarian regimes take cues from one another. They enact similar sounding laws or laws with roughly the same effect. So on that front, I see several broad themes in the region. First, there are broadly and vaguely worded laws. For example, ostensibly to protect national security, these usually prohibit incitement against the state or activities that disrupt social harmony. States have also tried to register NGOs and inspect their operations and funding. What this means is that these NGOs that resist such surveillance are automatically rendered illegal, and this subjects them to further state harassment. There are tighter laws on content that are being posted online, making it more difficult to remain anonymous. States are getting better at putting commercial pressure on internet giants like Google to censor online content. They also deploy their own cyber armies or trolls to crowd out critical comments against the government. What this means is that when you see more progressive leaders come into power, they will find it hard to repeal these laws because of the legislative effort needed. And we already see that in Thailand, where the military influence that is entrenched through the Senate because of the way the constitution is written. And because it requires a majority of a combined 2 chambers of parliament and to endorse a constitutional amendment. So typically these governments, because there's so many issues they need to attend to, they tend to focus on the bread and butter issues first, and they kick the civil liberties agenda down the road. As a result, the laws that are left entrenched, they are open to abuse by the more repressive factions of society or by future authoritarian leaders that come into power. So that I see is the biggest danger in the region.
Thanks, Hui. Dr. Pandit, over to you.
Yes. No. Okay. I think the decline of democracy in Asia still prevails. We witnessing the passing of generations of baby boomer to the new generations, not only in terms of ideas, but also social inequality and lack of opportunities for the younger generations to overcome all the hardship, not only in terms of economic hardship, but also political hardship as well. So, people in the economic sector always think that when the decline of economic downturn have reached the bottom, it would be a V shape or U shape. But up until now, I haven't seen any sign of we are at or we are approaching the U shape of political downturn in the region, especially in Thailand and Myanmar. So probably what important for us to explore a possibility to draft, in particular in Thailand, to draft a new social contract. It's very important for us to have a more free and fair election, as well as a free constitution, which is very important because, of course, we've seen that there are elections in Asian countries, but according to Stephen Levinsky and Lucan Wei's famous book, Competitive Authoritarian, shows that the new kind of authoritarian somehow infiltrate into the democratic practice, claiming that they have general election, they have free and fair election, but at the end, they still can steal the election, as we witnessed not only in Thailand, but probably other regions as well. So I think it's very important to draft a new constitution in the case of Thailand, and of course to surpass this very moment, probably we have to help or find a new possibility as well in Myanmar and in other countries to negotiate a new social contract, or which is more, let's say, democratic, and probably have open up for people's participants as well. So this is my view on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pandit. Thank you to all the speakers. So I've learned that actually it's basically from the failures of the democratic process, definitely to provide opportunities. So lack of opportunities at the end of the day results in this political power, authoritarian execution to have a very long-term effect, and it's very, very difficult, although for progressive leaders to see and to fight for the hardship, because it involves a lot of constitutional amendment. Okay, so my third question would be, what are main recommendations you would make to improve democracy in your country or the border region? Maybe I can start with Ms. Hui.
Okay, so 3 recommendations, very broadly: improve transparency. Transparency, for example, about the country's data, about how government services can be assessed, delivered, transparency about the political process. I think we need the equivalent of a freedom of information law for citizens in each country, to give citizens the power and the knowledge to both understand and engage in the governance of their own communities. Secondly, because more and more of our lives are being lived online, we need more and better education in relation to digital technologies, digital security, digital surveillance. Because of the kind of influence operations being conducted by foreign state parties, governments have generally tried to tighten restrictions on cyberspace. But this should not replace the kind of public education that we need to create a broad-based, what I call cyber awareness, and understanding about the potential as well as the risks embedded in the mobile phones that we carry around these days. So the right kind of cyber education can be a real tool for national security and improving civic participation if we play our cards right. And then finally, of course, a healthy media landscape, one where the media organizations are valued and supported by the community, where the media organizations serve as important platforms for conversations about the future of their countries. These days, people tend to assume that everybody can be a journalist. Everybody can blog, everybody can post pictures online, but journalism is hard work. It requires finding information, verifying facts, investigating leads, and making sense of difficult data. And all of that requires commitment and support. I have enormous respect for my peers in Myanmar, in Cambodia, and Vietnam, many of whom continue to do their work despite the threat of violence, legal harassment, financial distress. So I hope to see a lot more support for them.
Thanks, Ms. Hui. Maybe Dr. Sarah?
Yeah, I think the way to improve the democratic health of our societies is for civil society, that's most of us, to recognize that we can't do any of this on our own, but we have to do something about it. And what that means, in the way that I look at it, is that we need to find champions within political parties who agree with our values and agree with our principles and try to form a cross-party coalitions with civil society. But in order to do that, we have to maintain the distinction between working for political parties and working with them. And what we have to focus on is how to work with them, maintain our independence and our integrity, and not lay ourselves open to the charge that we are a Trojan horse or ally or whatever it is of a particular political party or government. I think that's very important, that we recognize that it's not one section of society that can do it on its own. It has to be a collaborative effort. In order to be able to enhance that, I think civil society organizations need to collaborate and cooperate more. And you know, when I look at my own country, every single donor is talking about strengthening the resilience of civil society. Every single organization is coming up with proposals about how to do that. Now, why on earth can't they get into one room and decide on how to consolidate it? You know, so as a consequence, it's becoming very bitty. And if you treat it as a buffet table, you give money to one particular civil society organization, it comes up and all of that for 2 years. After 2 years, its funding goes, it collapses. So you also have to make a choice in terms of which are the organizations that are going to be resilient, which have done this in the past, that can do it in the future and take it forward into the future as well, rather than do this buffet number. You know, so those are the two things that I would say. To strengthen civil society in terms of recognizing those organizations which are sustainable, and for civil society to get its act together to be able to work with government rather than for government.
Thank you, Dr. Sarah. Kunda?
Yeah, it all looks pretty dismal, and as a journalist, I tend to be a short-term pessimist and a long-term optimist about this. But the recommendations would be to find these younger, reform-minded candidates in each party or in new parties that can push through the reforms that are needed. And it's not as depressing as it looks, because in many countries we do have these candidates who are standing for and winning elections. In Nepal itself, in last year's federal elections, just 4 months or 5 months before the election, a new party, independent one, was formed, and it became the 4th largest in parliament. It was populated by technocrats. It had atmospheric scientists, doctors, technocrats. It had economists who really felt that they had to get into politics themselves instead of complaining about it all the time. So these are doers who sort of infiltrated the political process. Formerly civil society, some of them. Others were activists who decided that they have to get into politics and give politics got a bad name, so we have to give politics a good name, because that's the solution. Second would be to support an independent media. I think media is in trouble, and if you think that it is the 4th pillar of democracy, and the other 3 pillars are already a bit shaky because of the lack of separation of powers, or the erosion of separation of powers, then the media has to sort of prop up the table with this 4th leg. And there, the support has to be in such a way that it doesn't undermine the credibility of media. As far as possible, it should be domestic. And to bring back that independence, because without the financial independence, the financial stability, the media cannot be politically independent either. The third would be the elephant in the room. I don't know if it's a solution, but it's definitely a problem, is geopolitics. We haven't talked about it enough. I think there's the external factors in our democracies that are undermining it are really important, that we do not address enough, both within our countries and internationally. regional rivalries as well as global polarizations and the shifting sands of these polarizations where former allies have now become enemies, and therefore we smaller countries have to adjust our foreign policy and our systems to conform to these new alignments is something that affects the smaller countries. I think the Maldives is an example of, after the last election, of how geopolitics affects the electoral process as well as polity. Nepal is the other one, where you know, the enemy of your enemy is your friend, even if it is authoritarian and is attacking minorities and is against all the values that you stand for. That I think, I don't know how that is a solution, but definitely we have to think of that and find ways around it. And the third, I think ultimately it is really boiling down, as we said before, to economics and economic policy and economic reform. Our countries, all our countries in South Asia are remittance dependent. Nepal most of all, 26% of Nepal's GDP is dependent on remittances of our workers and people abroad, the diaspora. The other countries are also in the double digits. How do you make sure that the people who are abroad can also vote, for example, in the electoral process? They, at the moment, cannot vote in Nepal. You have to be physically present. And this represents a huge gap with 16 or 17% of your population not in the country. And of that 16%, the 20 to 45 age group, it's 60% of the males population is not within your country at election time. That's a huge gap in elections. So we have to think about these things. There's an electoral reform bill in parliament in Nepal at the moment, but it looks like the political parties don't want this absentee ballot clause in it because they are sure, and they're probably right, that the diaspora is anti-incumbent. Thank you.
Thanks, Kunda. Dr. Pandit?
I have 5 recommendations as an expert in Thai politics. So this is in particular for the Thai politics. The first one is constitutional drafting. Second one is about amnesty law. And the third one is about empowering non-governmental sector or countervailing institutions. And the fourth one would be international involvement. And the last one would be the issues of transitional justice. The first, constitutional drafting. It should be the first agenda for the Pheu Thai government to draft a new constitution and launch a project that canvass all the opinions. Every party within the pro-democratic faction should unite in recognizing the need to create a new social contract to an elected body, which is where we had a very good example back in 1997 constitution, and this could be a very good start. Second, amnesty law. Under the leadership of Pheu Thai party, an amnesty law should be proposed to drop all charges, including politically motivated case and the cases related to Criminal Code Section 112. I think this is very important for us to address this issue in Thai politics. Many of my students still at large, many of them fled the country for good, which is not a good prospect for Thai society in the long run. So to think of this amnesty law is the must for the very beginning. Third one, empowering non-governmental sector for or countervailing institution. I think this is the same thing that raised by the report of the idea. The Thai lawyer for human rights, or TLHR, bears a huge responsibility during the last couple of years, and I really admire their roles in protecting civil rights and political rights, but still they are in vain of needing all the help from international community, not only financial support, but also moral support and initiative of the new social contract as well to help them out from this situation. And also, I would like to highlight that the process of empowering university professors as public intellectuals, as a non-partisan, is needed at large as well. Fourth one, international involvement. The international community can play a pivotal role in improving human rights situation in Thailand. This can be achieved by advocating the reform of lèse-majesté law in judicial practices, while also recommending truth-seeking and reconciliation process. And lastly, this is really important as well, the transitional justice. To advance transitional justice in Thailand, the House of Representatives should establish an independent truth commission. This commission primary task should be investigating human rights violation and state violation against Thai citizens during the Prayut Chan-o-cha government. Additionally, they should appoint an independent commission to recommend solutions for the reconciliation and prosecution of corrupt officials. This is my recommendations.
Thank you, Dr. Pandit. So most of the esteemed panelists have highlighted few recommendations, include the amendments of the Constitution, the importance of the digital technology, journalism, of course, and I would like to actually respond to Dr. Sarah's answer with regards to the working with other political parties and also cross-party coalition. So allow me to share Malaysia work on Political Financing Act. Last year, IDEAS, Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs Malaysia, we act as a secretariat and work with other civil society organizations and also a few MPs, Member of Parliaments, 9 MPs actually, and 1 senator. So we form an all-party parliamentary group on political financing. So the idea is to deliberate, to discuss any issues with regard to political financing and try to legislate a Political Financing Act. So I must share with you the difficulties of getting them on board, because all of them have their own agendas. Mixing up opposition parties and government parties can be very, very challenging, but it can happen. So yeah, I would definitely suggest that, because last year, as of April 2022, the group managed to send a draft bill to the government. And this year also we made a revision. So due to the dissolution of the parliament last year, we formed a new APPG and we sent an amendment of the revised bill. So yeah, I would like to share Malaysia's work, and I believe that other countries can as well try to work on the cross-parties coalition. Okay, that's great. I think actually we have more time, right, to discuss the final question. So it's on countervailing institutions. So the question is as follows. Considering the decline in traditional checks like credible elections, you ruined checks for me. Okay, considering the decline in traditional checks like credible elections and effective parliaments, what are some successful countervailing institutions in the region, such as media, judiciary, and independent agencies, and why have they been effective? So maybe, Kunda, you want to take the lead?
I think the countervailing institution I'd like to speak to on is media itself. And there used to be a time in the bad old days when we used to joke that in a certain country there is freedom of press but no freedom after press. And now that has changed, mainly because of the anarchy of social media, where anything goes, that the freedom of expression is itself used to curtail press freedom. Through trolling, through intimidation, through threats, where anyone with a cogent, rational argument to further a debate is drowned out by the anger that is out there. And so most people do not even engage. And the only ones who engage are the ones who are angry and loud. And I think that is really leading to the undermining of the process itself, of the democratic process itself. It is affecting elections. It is fanning populism. There is the other good side to it, of course, because it can also be used for good, for mobilizing protests and participation on this. But then I think the overwhelming evidence from around the world is of a negative trend. Maria Ressa, who won the Nobel Prize for media, calls this the toxic sludge of anger and conspiracy theories that is drowning out everything else, the pipeline of hate, the tyranny of trends. And this is the radicalization through algorithm that is manufacturing this mass consent, where what we used to call the mainstream media is just not, doesn't have the power to counter this at all. So what do you do with fact-checking when facts don't matter anymore? And we're made to just distrust everyone and everything. So, we've been thinking about this in media ourselves, and being from the legacy media, which is probably a dinosaur, we've been thinking, where is our role now then of being the filter, or being the fourth pillar, or playing the adversarial role as we so grandly called ourselves. So I think we have to really go to where the readers are and the viewers are. They will not come to us anymore, which means packaging the message better, the content better. We have to go to become content creators rather than just be journalists. Public service broadcasting, that ancient concept, has to be turned into public service internet. And I think someone pointed out media literacy, and there where you're not just training journalists, but you're also training the public in what to believe, what not to believe, who owns it, who is driving it, so that they're much clearer about the messaging that comes to them through their devices. And in media literacy, of course, it will be the job of government. But all the other issues of media reform, I think we in the mainstream media need that transition to find our voices again, because otherwise we're being drowned out. And that is, again, having an impact on the larger polity in all our countries.
Thank you, Kunda. Dr. Pandit, over to you.
I'd like to draw our attention to a more broader issues of social memory. Of course, we are now encountering the hardship in not only in politics, but also in economic downturn. But one of the most important thing of every society that encountering atrocities from authoritarian regime is that how to record the memories, how to keep the evidence of human rights violation, how to keep all the memories of the people who have been suppressed. And I think it's very important for not only the case of Thailand, but also Myanmar as well, to draw the international attention to this issue, because without recording all the important evidence, it's going to give a blank check for authoritarian regime and its ruling parties. So I think this is really important as well to address. And secondly, I think it's really important for, as I mentioned earlier, to have the public intellectual. Nowadays, of course, we have gurus, we have political pundits in YouTube, in social medias, but it's really hard.
I believe they're called cyber troopers, right? Sorry, just interjecting, right?
Yeah, it's very important as well to have a more independent scholars who can say with non-partisan ideas on the social polarization. At this moment, and in the case of Thailand, we experience that all the public intellectual who wants to speak up has been bombarded by these kind of polarized groups. So it's very important as well to use the space like university to be a non-partisan place for people can speak out of their ideas and probably possibility during the transitional justice process and also for the future reconciliation and democratic development. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Pandit. Dr. Sarah?
Yeah. With regard to the countervailing institutions, I just want to focus on the judiciary for a moment because in a number of our cases, there have been verdicts in cases, judgments that have shocked perhaps the political establishment by not going along with it and coming down on the side of dissenters and of reform. Now, I think the key thing with regard to the judiciary is how is it appointed? What is method of appointment? There are some cases in which, like in the US Supreme Court, you used to say that you appointed someone as a judge of the Supreme Court because you thought that they were right-wing, but over a period of time you found out that they were fairly left-wing in terms of their judgments. Now, in our particular positions, we can't rely on the judiciary to be the bastion, as it were, of the defense of democratic freedoms. Because at the end of the day, the judiciary is there to interpret the law. It's a law that Parliament passes. If it's a bad law, they nevertheless have to talk about how that bad law is respected and perhaps point out ways in which that bad law can be reformed. Now, in the Sri Lankan context, the higher judiciary is appointed by the Constitutional Council, which was something that we took from Nepal many years ago, where the Constitutional Council is weighted in favor of the politicians. There are only 3 members of civil society that are actually on that Constitutional Council. So we've had judgments that have gone with dissent and reform, but on the other hand, we've had judgments that have upheld the status quo on the grounds that it is the role of the judiciary to interpret the law rather than to make the law. And so that's why the last judgment that we had of the Supreme Court, where people took former President Mahinda Rajapaksa, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, his brother, and 2 governors of the central bank to court, saying that they were responsible for the economic crisis and the bankruptcy that hit our country. I suppose the first question to ask is, does the Supreme Court have the right or the competence to rule on whether X or Y is responsible for the bankruptcy of the country? Aren't those political decisions? But I think what happened is that they took a very expanded version of public interest litigation, taken mostly from India, and said that they didn't do, when they should have, they didn't do X and Y, and therefore they were liable. But they weren't held responsible. They said that these people contributed significantly towards this. So the court also has to be therefore fairly careful in terms of what it says and does, because if you bridge that separation of powers between executive, legislature and judiciary, then you are in a very different world of governance entirely. Because the question is, who appoints the judiciary? Who is it responsible to? When there are questions of legality as well as legitimacy at issue in our societies, we have to therefore be very careful about who we rely on.
Thanks, Dr. Sarah. Ms. Hui, over to you.
I agree with what Kunta mentioned about how we need to focus a bit more about on the media. On all the other fronts, I'm rather pessimistic, at least with regards to my region. I see very few successful recent examples of bastions of democratic freedom, so to speak. Even courts, anti-corruption commissions, so-called independent agencies can be captured by the establishment if the conditions are right. And also, media organizations, they are the first in line to be shut down or censored when dictators come into power. The one exception I see, for example, is what's happening with the Myanmar journalists who have been exiled from the country. and how they have established XR media outlets in Thailand and other places. And this is partly also because of the historical legacy. There were already established networks of exiled Myanmar media under the previous junta regime. So when a coup took place in 2021, these media outlets simply went back to their former modes of operation, collecting information underground and broadcasting into Myanmar from abroad. They have proven to be a valuable source of information about governance within Myanmar, as well as attempts by the resistance organizations to imagine a new future for Myanmar that will involve a genuine federal democracy. And that's about it, really.
Thanks, Hui. Thanks again to all the panelists, Kunda highlighting the importance of packaging the news or journalists to rather act as just a journalist, but to act as an creator content. So if you wonder what creator content is, you can always ask Gen Z. We have a lot of reels in Instagram, TikTok, and everything. It's next level. And then Dr. Pandit also highlight on the memory record, very good points actually, the importance of recording human rights mission, and of course the role of the university to form the non-partisan ideas. And Dr. Sarah also highlighted the importance of asking how is the appointment of judiciary and how we cannot expect the judiciary to defend democracy because of their role to interpret the law. And also we highlighted again the role of the media, especially for the Myanmar communities. Okay, so I think we actually have way for the final question. So maybe for this one, you can try to answer within 3 minutes so that we will be able to open the questions to the floor. The question is with regards to protest and repression. Do mass protests as countervailing institutions led to democratic change despite government backlash and civil freedom restrictions? And from your experience, what's needed to ensure a safe space for public participation? So for this one, maybe Ms. Hui, you would like to take the lead?
I think my answer here will be brief. I think a mass protest are very unlikely to lead to democratic change, at least in the region that I cover. Partly because, like I said before, the tools of authoritarian rule have become increasingly entrenched, and it's quite easy for the state to weaponize them against protesters as and when needed. This includes multiple lawsuits against protest leaders, or worse, physical harassment or violence. At the same time, there's a tendency for governments to try to delegitimize these large protests by alleging that foreign groups are instigating them. And the minute the protests turn violent, the narrative turns into one about law and order rather than political space, which leads to further repression. But I think mass protests do work to expand political space if there is a clear communication strategy and about eventual dialogue with the authorities, and also if there is broad support from the public. There should be clear, fair rules of engagement, and states can use them as starting points for conversations about difficult topics rather than try to shut them down outright.
Okay, thanks, Ms. Hui. Dr. Pandit?
Yeah, of course, Thailand experienced polarizations and youth uprisings during the last 2 decades, and especially the recent years. We witnessed that the mass protests cannot bring the change in the regime. But we witnessed that Thailand's 2023 general election shows a possibility to challenge the competitive authoritarian regime by going to the ballot stations. But still, we have one last jigsaw to put in, which is a new constitution, a better framework of power relations and check and balance mechanism in our society. That is possible to overcome without, violence. That is possible with a more peaceful transition for any society. But again, we have to insist that by general election and people participation to put on, to press the government on the process of drafting new social contract is very important, the very important first step to a better condition of our democratic development. So taking from this lesson, I hope that it gives some light to all other countries in the region that is struggling for a better society. I think this is the very first step. But again, we witness also the suppression of authoritarian regime against its own people in many places, which is something that need international attention. We need more support in many ways, not only humanitarian support. Actually, along the border between Thai and Myanmar, we have to send a lot of helps for those people movement and other people who fled from Myanmar as well. So this is very important for us to establish a more safer place, a more democratic place for as well, not only for ourselves but for our neighbors as well.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Pandit. Kunda?
Nepal's democratic space has been opened by mass protests on the streets. We had two people's movements, one in 1980, the other next in 1990. One led the absolute monarchy to become a constitutional monarchy. The second one led to reforms in the constitution. So it's as long as protests on the streets are not engineered or manipulated, or as long as there's no incitement to violence or protesters are not using weapons, even if they are supported from behind or funded from behind, I think it's a safety valve and is an outlet for political dissent, which should not be suppressed, because suppressing it would then lead to even more problems. And I think so the key would be whether, and I think if it is supported either by domestic actors or geopolitical actors abroad, people will know about it. And that would be the kiss of death to any protest. I think that the litmus test would be whether violence is used or there's an incitement to violence.
Thanks, Kunda. Dr. Saran?
Yeah, in a sense, the whole question of whether political protests do make a difference is somewhat like, Joseph Stalin's rhetorical question, how many divisions does the Pope have? And the point about the popular protests is that it does signal that there is anger, frustration, dissent that has no other outlet given the institutions and processes in the country than to come out onto the street. Yeah? And I suppose its success in that respect depends on two main factors. One is the use of violence. As long as it eschews the use of violence, I think it can succeed, because the moment it becomes violent, it gives the state, which is after all supposedly to have the monopoly over violence in any society, grounds that it is subversive, treasonable, and all of those things. And then it starts losing credibility. And if I look at the case of Sri Lanka, the middle class, which swelled the ranks of the Aragale, would have left immediately as violence began. The second thing, of course, is this, is that, okay, you come together with a broad demand, like get X out of government, or Y is corrupt, or whatever, but you have to have a political program to follow that up, or it's a flash in the pan. It's a flash in the pan. The political establishment has allowed you to let off steam, but the political establishment is still back in the saddle, and nothing really has changed. So that is why I go back to what I said before as well. That is that civil society or the reform-minded sections of politics need to go across the barriers, organizational barriers, identify the champions in the variety of political parties, civil society come together, and even in our society as well, let's face it, although we say that we are secular, religious leaders play a very important role. When we're talking about transitional justice, we're talking about reconciliation, we're talking about national unity, they have a tremendous role to play. In 2019, in the presidential election in Sri Lanka, Gotabaya Rajapaksa ran his campaign through a network of Buddhist temples throughout the country. That's a very difficult network to defeat. And quite frankly, we've not had a single Buddhist leader in Sri Lanka come out and talk about the importance of human rights, the importance of reconciliation. They have come out and talked about just war, but not about reconciliation and national unity. So we need to get that coalition together and engage with them so that when the moment comes, they will be able to step in with the political agenda.
Thanks, Dr. Sarah. So now is I hope, the moment that you're all waiting for with the questions. We will now open the questions to the floor. So anyone who would like to ask questions, just raise your hand, and yeah, we will definitely ask you.
Good afternoon. My name is Imtiaz Maqbul. I'm the executive editor of Travel Impact Newswire. I cover the travel and tourism industry. I'd just like to follow up the last comment by the gentleman from Sri Lanka about the role of religious leaders. Clearly, all the media, the judiciary, the political establishment, the corporate establishments have got a vested interest in hijacking the religious leaders, and you mentioned the Hindutva agenda as well in India, which is also following the same track. I was just wondering if that is actually featured in the report, because really it has played a very important role in the shaping of many of the geopolitical, social, cultural forces. And it's really looking as if it's shaping up towards a clash of civilizations. And I'm wondering if Ms. Shah can actually tell us if that has been a very potent force that is included in the report, and can also be, it's now particularly being seen as a part of the problem, whereas in actual fact it should be very much a part of the solution. The second question I have is whether on the issue of geopolitics, what do you think is going to be the impact of the shutting down of a lot of the democratic space on the discussion of wars, Russia, Ukraine, the Israel-Palestine? Today, we are finding many scientists, actors, writers, professors having to be, well, being muted really, just because they are seen as being pro-Palestinian, name calling going on, all this kind of stuff, and of course the hate speech agenda as well. So, to look at the ramifications of the geopolitical situation, particularly two very specific wars that are being fought right now, how do you see that as making this whole incendiary and inflammable situation worse, particularly in the absence of any clear people, leaders who can be a part of the solution? Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Sarah, maybe you want to address the first question? And also just a reminder to lean on to the mic.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there is an explicit capturing of the whole religious dimension in this. But let's face it, as I said, I mean, you know, institutions are consolidations of bias, and bias also comes through the religious direction and orientation. So to that extent, there is that. How one does that, of course, is a major challenge, because I don't think it can be purely quantitative. There is a large qualitative, inherently qualitative element to it, which you have to try and capture. With regard to the sort of silencing of dissent and all of that kind of thing, I think, you know, at the end of the day, the whole point about dissent, the whole point about rights, is that it is a struggle. You just have to continue with it. But one point that I would make, though, is this, is that one thing that the Hamas-Israel, that conflict that's ongoing, has shown is that we need structural reform of the international machinery that we have for conflict prevention and resolution. And here I'm referring to the only thing that we have, which is the United Nations and the Security Council. We need to have some kind of change so that when it comes out with a statement, it is truly reflective, or as truly reflective as it possibly can be, of international opinion, rather than a consensus that was basically made in 1945.
Thanks, Dr. Sarah. Is there any question? Okay.
Hi, my name is my name is Ali Salim. I'm based in Bangkok. My question is to panelists from South Asia. I mean, I'm from Pakistan, and at least in my country, politics and democracy has become a discourse or a business for people from 75 to 95. Anyone below that is out of the game. Similar to the situation for civil society, political parties, that it has to be 75 to 95 years. I mean, I spent last 7 years looking at the role of young people and youth participation in political processes. We had about consultations with over 25,000 young people globally. One of the things we found that young people know what they want, but there are no mechanisms and means for them to express that. And especially when I would dare to extend, I believe Sri Lanka, Nepal, you have the same situation that no one below 75 is in power. So this aging of civil society, aging of political parties, and this aging of what we call instruments of accountability at societal level, is that not the primary factor of failure of democracy in South Asia, or it has to do with all of this geopolitical situation and the multilateralism and its challenges? So I would like to hear your views on that how much this aging of our structure is actually damaging what we call liberal discourse.
Thank you. Okay. So maybe Kunda, you can take the question on the aging of political parties and maybe also to react to the questions on the geopolitical disasters.
Well, from one aging journalist to an aging politician, in Nepal, it's become quite hilarious, as you said, the gerontocracy that has been in power. The current prime minister has been prime minister 3 times. His predecessor had been prime minister 5 times, and it looks like he's coming back again. It's just over and over again, the same faces. The young Turks in these parties are 60 years old. Well,
I agree.
Yeah. So it is something that we raise in the media all the time, but doesn't seem to make that much of a difference. The only hope, the silver lining, is the party that I mentioned earlier, the one that became the 4th largest in parliament after just having been established 4 months before elections, which has young people in it, technocratic-minded people. So maybe that's where the hope is. And across South Asia, I think whenever we've had an interim government, including in Pakistan, interim government before elections, independent interim governments, it has been the best governed time for our countries, which is why in Bangladesh there's such opposition from the ruling party to an interim government to oversee January's election, because they know that an interim government will be independent. So, I think we know what the problems are. We have the solutions. We just have to get these oldies out of the way. And it doesn't look like they're going to move by themselves. So internal party democracy is also going to be important within the parties, because there are enough reform-minded youngsters within the parties who want to move on.
Kunda, maybe the second question on the geopolitical disasters, or
That
perhaps any other. Ms.
That
Hui.
question is too difficult to answer. Maybe Marwan can answer it at the back. Maybe with his question.
Ms. Hui, I think you want to try?
I just want to make a point about youth and aging and old people in politics, because that's big question in Thailand as well. I mean, I remember when I was when the youth protests broke out 2-3 years ago, and there was some amount of skepticism among the older generation of civil society activists about, oh, what do these young people know? They have no sense of direction, they have no clear strategy, they are mainly galvanizing their schoolmates out onto the streets. But look where we are now. During the past general election, we had several of these protest leaders, youth protest leaders, take part in the elections as a member of the Move Forward Party. At the same time, some of these protest leaders who I felt initially were a bit more militant in their views, they started seeing the positive side of engaging with the formal institutions of democracy. So, which is why I want to point out that this is the importance of mentorship, the importance of having the veterans within civil society have that dialogue with younger activists and guide them so that they can be part of the process rather than being outside the process.
Thanks, Ms. Hui Yi. So perhaps another 2 questions from the floor. Can go ahead.
Hi, I'm Marwan Marker of Nikkei Asia. I haven't read your report, so I'm not in a position to comment on it. But something that I always find lacking in presentations like this is while, I mean, you've painted somewhat of a bleak picture, some areas where there are shortcomings and maybe advances. One thing that I have noticed as a journalist covering elections is that governments are using democracy to advance themes that are completely that go against the spirit of human rights, for instance. I mean, the Philippines is one example that was mentioned here. The former president, despite his campaign to kill people during his war on drugs, remained hugely popular. Prime Minister Modi is destined to win the next election despite his very anti-minority political campaign. He's using democracy to that advantage, and as Sarah mentioned, Sri Lanka was also a classic case where a majoritarian agenda is being used and democracy is helping the cause. So this is the underbelly of democracy that I think reports like this, like yours, need to also address how this democracy is being captured for something quite different. And we saw it to some extent even in the US during the years of Donald Trump, and we might see it again at the next presidential election. So I hope some of the panelists can reflect on how this issue can be addressed. Thanks.
Just to say that this is exactly why we take the approach we do, which is not to say a country is or is not a democracy, but instead to focus on the specific aspects of democracy that we think have been impacted by events and developments around the world. So we don't say that the US, for example, is or is not a democracy. We say there have been declines with regard to, in the US example, social group equality. So what is that about? Why? And then how does that decline or advance impact democracy in the broader context? So we agree with you 100% that that term democracy, because there's no consensus about what it means, can be manipulated by very undemocratic forces. And we hope that our approach is a first attempt to mitigate that generalization. But in terms of the freedom of expression question, I just wanted to say that what we are now seeing in the aftermath of the Hamas-Israeli violence is that trend of declines in freedom of expression around the world have been going on for such a long time. And we've seen them continue in the most recent data. But what we also know is that they do tend to drop even more severely during times of crisis. And so it's not that surprising that we now see more restrictions on freedom of expression as people start to debate in the public sphere about what's happening in Israel and Palestine, but also in Ukraine. We saw the same thing. As soon as the war in Ukraine broke out, voices that were countering to say, but for example, there was a lot of debate about how Ukrainian refugees were being received in parts of Europe and comparing that to how refugees from other parts of the world had been received or not received for many years, and what accounts for that inequality. Those kinds of things were suppressed in the aftermath of the outbreak of war because people wanted to talk about how this is a fight to protect democracy. So nobody wanted to hear, right, about why some of the responses were actually undemocratic or unequal. But that's the very reason why we have to talk about it at those times, because it reveals the sorts of things that stay under the surface otherwise, in my opinion. So the report doesn't go into detail on the role of religious extremists or religion, but faith-based organizations would be part of the family of countervailing institutions. And so I think it's a fascinating thing to explore in the future, how faith-based institutions contribute or detract from democratic performance.
Thanks, Dr. Seema. So maybe one last question.
Hello. Sorry. Yeah, if you can hear me. Hi, my name is Eliza. I just have a couple of questions. Feel free to take whichever most resonates. The first was on the private sector. I didn't hear very much said about the private sector, and given that the bank balances of certain companies supersedes the sizes of multiple governments, I was curious about that, not least because, of course, any governments that try to perceive themselves as working in the interest of their populations are often hesitant to regulate innovation. And so we find that companies, particularly when we're talking about technology, have a free rein to do things that we then see undermine the capacity for development, participation, safety. So I'm curious about, the panel's view on the private sector. And the last one is, there has been some conversation about the media, but beyond media, I was thinking about how we live in a world perhaps aided by the media, but mostly by our technological devices, of a splintering reality. And that democracy needs a sort of agreement on what we all see to be happening, and then different, for example, political parties present a response to that reality, right? Our approach will be this, and your approach will be that, or civil society says, this is how we plan on rectifying this thing that we agree to be reality. But there is increasingly no more shared reality. People have different versions of what they think to be real. With the COVID pandemic, for example, not everybody even agreed that there was a virus that could kill us all, and so therefore we needed a vaccine or something else. So what does democracy look like, or from your various vantage points, how do we get at anything that feels like cohesion or solutions for, government by the people, of the people, for the people, when the people live in multiple realities? Thanks.
Thank you. So maybe we can each have 3 minutes. So the panelists, whichever questions that you would like to answer, feel free to.
Can I just have one more point?
Okay, sure. Very short points, hopefully.
The Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand in the 1970s was manned by, and well, not just men, but also many women, by journalists who had come out of Vietnam when they got thrown out. And I remember when I joined the club in the 1970s, that one of the hallmark of journalism in this part of the world was these people had the gumption to stand up and tell the truth to the American people about what was really going on in the Vietnam War. And that is what contributed to an end to the war. When they found out, when the vast majority of the public found out in America that they were being lied to. They were being lied to. And many of the journalists from that war moved to Bangkok when they got thrown out after 1975. So if you have a chance, I'd really recommend that you study many of the issues of Dateline, because many of their stories are told there. I think it's very inspiring when we talk about freedom of speech, freedom of media, et cetera, that at the end of the day, it's all about getting the truth out to the public and showing that the vast majority of people are being fooled by the liars among the corporations, the judges, whoever. and that truth can actually be the most powerful countervailing force. And it's actually up there all the way in those magazines up there. So if you get a chance, I think you might find it very worthwhile to study some of those magazines and see how that clubs like this can actually become a very important part of the solution. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We will definitely go check them out after this. Okay, so for the panelists, the first question is on the aging of political parties. The second one is the view on the private sector. Third is media on shared reality. And finally, what does democracy looks like? So I think I will just start with Ms. Hui, and then we can move to the other panelists.
Very brief comments about the question on shared realities. I think that is the reality, right? We have a diversity of ideas of what it means, on what certain causes mean, what the media means these days. What can we fall back on? We can fall back on the basic principles, like I mentioned earlier, on the need for transparency, on the need to know about certain processes within government, within our institutions. We can fall back on the need for education about what's happening in the cyberspace, as well as in real life. We can fall back on the need to acknowledge and respect the diversity of opinions, but also protect the shared spaces for dialogue. And that's pretty much the only way forward, I see. On the question about the private sector, I don't see I think there's a reason why it's not been mentioned in this discussion about democracy. I see it as a tool for change or not. It's prone to capture. Within Thailand, in Thailand, for example, the question of monopolies has been around for many, many years. It was also a topic that was discussed during the recent general election. And it is difficult to address monopolies simply because they are so powerful in Thailand, and also because they are also politically powerful. So yeah, it's really up to companies and people who run these companies to decide if they can be a tool for opening of democratic space.
Okay, Ms. Hui, maybe one concluding remarks?
It's fine, I don't need to conclude.
Okay. All right, so for the other panelists, if you like to conclude, please do so. So Dr. Pandit.
Yeah, I think there is no instant formula of how democracy should be practiced. That's why democracy at the same time can be manipulated. That's why I think the report somehow is also relevant to me in the sense that we can map what is practiced, what has not been practiced. This is the very important of having this kind of report for us to understand not only my countries but also the other countries, how they are doing in terms of democratic practices. And of course, I mentioned many times in my presentation that there is the so-called situation that many countries are seeming like a democratic country. They have facade constitution, they have election, but in practice there are independent organizations, independent bodies that regulate and also take down or even steal the election from people's will. So we have to take a closer look of how democracy has been practiced in one particular country from one to another country to understand the whole possibility of challenging or making a new change to that particular situation. And of course, also it is addressed in the report as well that there are competing discourse within the notion of democracy, which is a libertarian version and the majoritarian version. In Thailand, we witnessed that, after the Move Forward Party stepped down from its leadership and handed over to Pheu Thai Party, and then all the discourse became like, Move Forward Party is not so-called the majority of Thai people, counting by the number who voted for Move Forward Party, which is partly true, but at the same time, it's about the election. It's about the people's will who came to the ballot station, that they wanted this change, but this change was finally suppressed by the mechanism decided by the bad founding fathers of Thai constitution. That's why it's really important to see all the minor issues in the report as well. This is my recommendation. And also talking about the private sectors, I think it's very important as well to see also the idea of measure how integrity and transparency assessment has been monitored. In Thailand, you might be amazed to learn that the Thai army is one of the most transparent organization. And one measurement is that they count by public participation. So they have the public go to the army's website and do something. So you know how it goes, right, from this point. That even the ITA assessment can be manipulated as well. So don't trust that, okay? We have to redesign the whole process of ITA assessment as well. This is one example. And also, the Thai private sector actually has a lot of scandals related to ITA issues. So we can, of course, we have to take a closer look and redesign the whole process of measurement as well. So this is just one aspect of how to see the role of private sector in terms of ITA. And also ITA also contributes to democratic practice as well. So I think this is my response to the questions.
Thanks, Dr. Pandit. Dr. Sara?
Yeah. I'm assuming that all of us here and in this room consider democracy to be a good in itself and not merely a process. But the question that I would want to put forward to you is whether the Generation Z and Alpha and whatever, whether they think likewise, or whether they see democracy indeed as a process. It'd be interesting to see how many of them actually participate in elections going forward. And is it the case that as the divide, and that's happening too, between the rich and the poor in our societies increases, as to whether the majority of the poor will be wanting 3 square meals a day, food, clothing, shelter? Those are the questions, after all, that democracy as a orientation, a philosophy of government was supposed to deal with, to provide for the good life. Does it, will it do that anymore? Will it merely be a process? The basic process of choosing between choice and change in a functioning society. Whereas the notion of rights and all of that will take second place. In Sri Lanka, for example, survey after survey have found that the most popular institution is the army. It's also the most trusted institution. The two that have constantly been at the bottom of the pile are political parties and the police.
Police?
And the police. You know. So, I mean, that's very interesting to find out as to whether, when we look at this, we look at it from the paradigm of our consensus of 1945, of a welfare state, of fundamental rights and all of that. Do we need to change that paradigm into the future? And as for journalism, Kunda, I wonder, you know, in 20 years' time, will there be journalists? Everyone is a journalist. Today, what's the function that journalists do? They report news and they fight amongst each other saying, I'm telling the truth, you're not. You know, so it's now citizens' journalism. What is the truth, therefore, in that particular context? So, I mean, all I wanted to say is this, is that I personally believe that, yes, democracy is important, and I certainly will fight in whatever way I can to preserve the democratic institutions and processes. But I am also just beginning to be aware that I might be fighting against history.
Thanks, Dr. Sarah. So maybe final remarks from Kunda.
Yeah, I think we have to look at why populists are popular. And if you trace that question, then I think you'll get to media, both social media and mainstream media. And the way populists do it, and I think they probably have midnight WhatsApp group chats where demagogues exchange notes with each other. This is how I did it. Oh, that worked? Okay, I'll do the same. Because they are all doing the same thing, which is co-opt, capture, or weaponize social media. And if it's the mainstream media, they will buy into, or through cronies who are in the private sector, infiltrate the mass media and the mainstream media. So they are controlling the messaging. They're even controlling the movies, Bollywood, by sending the messages out through even that sort of media. So this is how Bong Bong came back, the reincarnation of Marcos. This is how it's happening in India. This is what's happening elsewhere as well. So it's how do you deal with this is the question, and I think if we are not to give up on journalism, Sarah, then since I also teach journalism, I don't know whether it's worth it, but I'm teaching journalism to younger, aspiring reporters. We have to be a little optimistic and say there is a future, there is a role for this, because otherwise it's a failed case, because free expression, the way it is going out, is actually undermining press freedom and democracy itself. But how do you tackle that without undermining the freedom of expression? Banning TikTok, as Nepal did last week, overnight, we banned TikTok. It is an attack on free press, free expression, but it was also anarchic. So I think the balance has to be really struck right, where the regulation has to be there. Facebook now has a mechanism for removing incendiary content. In certain countries, it works better than others. Where it is a local language, where Facebook doesn't have that much of a check and balance role, it doesn't work at all. And all this hate speech is going out in local languages which they cannot monitor. TikTok is just so aggressively addictive, its algorithm, that and the redressal system is so remote and inaccessible that it is really the driving force in all this. So I have my hope in the next generation of journalists, some of them my students, who believe in the role that media has to play. It is the other side of the democracy coin, and if one is stronger, the other side also becomes stronger. And we have to hold our hope for that, otherwise. And then I think we focus mostly on content, but we have to pay attention to the dispersal, this dissemination, the packaging. Because without that, whatever you write, an op-ed that's 2,000 words is just going to disappear and vanish. And how do you keep that participation in democracy alive? I was glad to see in the report that Nepal was right up there, number 6. I think that's because our election turnout is still 70%. And the reason that is happening is because there is still a role for the mainstream press in making sure that the issues are debated and are raised, and people feel it's important enough for them to go out to the ballot box and put their votes in. So I don't think we should give up yet, but we should definitely change the style we're doing things in. Thank you.
Thanks, Kunda. Thank you to Dr. Sima for the presentation. Thank you to Dr. Pandit. Concluding remarks? Okay, maybe.
Not really concluding, but just a response to what Sarah said.
Okay.
I think indices can always be always controversial. They are imperfect. There always be arguments about who's on top, who's at the bottom. and how ranking should be, but I'm not Gen Z, but I think that democracy is not an end state. It is a process. It is in the practice of it that we make it a democracy, and the idea is that no matter where you are at any point in time, you can move forward and open the spaces, and that's what makes it a democracy. So despite all the pessimistic comments I've made over the course of this discussion, I still feel that there are spaces that can be opened up, and so which is why I appreciate IDEA in doing this report. It opens up spaces for conversations about what makes democracy, despite all these contested versions of democracy.
Okay, so thanks again, Dr. Sima, for the presentation. To all our esteemed panelists, Dr. Pandit, Ms. Hui, Dr. Sarah, Kunda. So now I would like to formally close the discussion. And also thank you for all the attendees, amazing participations and questions. And now I would like to invite Fuadi Pitsuwan on stage to deliver the closing remarks. Please welcome.
Thank you. The only thing standing before you and lunch is me, so I recognize that. So as president of Surin Pitsuwan Foundation, which is an effort to institutionalize the mission of my late father, who was the chair of International IDEA Board of Advisor from 2015 to when he passed away in 2017. I would like to thank all the panelists, distinguished guests, and all the attendees for engaging in a fruitful discussion, marking the launch of International IDEA's Global State of Democracy 2023 report. To sum things up briefly, the Global State of Democracy report investigates the state of democracy around the world in 4 key areas: representation, rights, rule of law, and participation. Specifically for the Asia-Pacific region, broadly speaking, the backsliding of democratic quality appears to be slowing down, except, of course, in Myanmar and Afghanistan. And in Thailand, although it is a net positive, like Ajahn Pandit said, in relative terms, we miss what could have been. Nevertheless, it is difficult to say that the state of democracy is better when civic participation, civic space faces continued challenges with declines in freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and freedom of association and assembly observed in numerous countries. The waning effectiveness of legislatures and a deficiency in judicial independence contribute to this threat, promoting the emergence of alternative and informal mechanisms that constrain government authoritarianism. The report highlights the role of what I would call the 4th and 5th estates. The report used the terms countervailing institutions, with the first 3 estates, namely the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, acting out of balance and sometimes working against democracy. Additional estates have proven to be essential in defending democratic ideals. The 4th estate is the media, particularly the investigative kind. So it is appropriate that this report and we are here, is being launched, and we are here today at the FCCT talking about this. A free and independent media is necessary to hold power accountable and to facilitate the flow of information to the public. The 5th estate is embodied by civil society, public participation, and public intellectuals. A robust and focused civil society, along with an engaged public scrutiny against established powers, constitutes an integral aspect of a healthy democracy. As Alexis de Tocqueville have put it, the health of a democratic society may be measured by the quality of function performed by private citizens. But what the report did not highlight, and this is a great ending to this event, is the role of international scrutiny, or what Stephen Levinsky would call international linkages. The work of organizations such as International IDEA is important in keeping the gears of democracy turning, because even to those leaders with authoritarian bent, international legitimacy does matter. And it is important to make those established powers work to earn it. The interested eyes of the international community are not only crucial in keeping those in power accountable, but also in providing the benchmark and the standards to which the fourth and fifth estate can have references and understand the relative states of democracy around the world in order for us to push ourselves to do better. The Surin Pitsuwan Foundation wants to thank International IDEA and their researcher and staff for the hard work they put into this report. My father would have been proud. And I look forward to future years when the report can be more positive about the global state of democracy. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we would like to invite everyone for lunch. Thank you. So, yes. You can also get copies of the report in front here.